something happens and I can't attend right at the beginning.
I couldn't find the link. Where was the link?
Well, the thing is, it's not listed as a link anymore. It's listed as click here and you'll go to the Zoom. And if you click on that thing, it goes there.
Well, just let you guys know, it's not obvious where that is.
I know, I agree. It's Marco's.
It should be like huge. Start here. I mean, I read the whole thing, and I went to several different. I couldn't find it. Thank you anyway. So here I am.
So, yeah. So, because next week I have, it's a university commitment. I have. I'm on a committee that's evaluating scholarship applications, and they've decided to set it up next Thursday morning, so I couldn't really get out of it. So I'm afraid I'm not as creative as you guys for my intro. I feel like I should step up to the plate and do something a bit more organized, but I didn't do that. So
I will note that that I hadn't done the reading as the two of you have, Johnny and Geoffrey. This is your second or third or fourth reading of Bateson, and I didn't give the backstory why I did the Metalogue, but it was because of a dream I had, and I was told by Nora Bateson to do a Metalogue on why we set up rules and why we break them. And then in this reading, the games we play, Metalogue, or I can't remember the title,
right, yeah.
Along with Nora's work, both mentioned the breaking of the rules or setting up the rules just to break them type of mentality. So somewhere along the line, my other selves picked up on.
Well, I think it's brilliant what you guys do, but I didn't get it organized. So I will give a little intro about it. More anecdotal, maybe a leaf after Johnny's book. So I do think this stuff about play is perhaps, in my opinion, one of the most important contributions that Bateson has made in his career. And because it's so central to what humans do. I was thinking as I was coming down the stairs this morning that I was thinking about how, so I was thinking, fashion's a kind of play that's serious. And then I was thinking, well, so is academia, because what are we doing in the academic world? In the research world, well, we're playing with ideas, but of course, when we teach, we're also playing with people, right? So, and then I was thinking, yeah, but I think just about everything that we humans do has this play element in it. I mean, in terms of work, even in a way, the whole idea of a profession, which is a way of sort of showing that a group is being responsible towards the public, even though it's dealing with issues that are playful, right? So I think about the occupational therapists that I work with at the clinic, and occupational therapy is a kind of play, because it's an engagement with people with disability to rethink their environments in a kind of a playful way. And so, the profession is about ensuring that that is that is done responsibly, right? So, so there's this interplay between being serious and being playful, which Gregory Bateson examines, particularly in the Metalogue, the sort of, how can you be serious and playful at the same time, which is this dialogue with his daughter. And then in the article, it's about play in relation to communication and in relation to psychotherapy. So that was another thing I think of, play in a way, game playing, because game playing has become huge in our society, right? So with the online environments that are provided, a lot of people are spending a lot of their time playing games now. And in a way, although, you know, video games and things like that there are some negative or worrisome sides to that. There's also a lot of positive things about people who are spending their time playing. And in a way, I think Gregory Bateson is sort of saying play is a kind of communal therapy, because he makes this link between psychotherapy and play, and in a communal way, right? So it's like psychotherapy for the masses, if you like. In a way, that's what playing and games are in a certain kind of way. Nora Bateson, in her text, it's funny. I matched up, you know, because we're doing 2 Nora Bateson chapters for every one Gregory Bateson chapter. I think it's interesting that in this Nora Bateson chapter, the second chapter from Nora Bateson, she references directly this article. So it's like, you know, which was a bit fortuitous, because I hadn't read the 2 articles to match them up like that. But you know, I'm sort of wondering if Nora Bateson didn't write her book Reading Steps to an Ecology of Mind, and as she progressed, she wrote different articles in relation to it, because in a way it seems to work out that way. Oh, another thing about play, I also feel that nature is kind of playing with us right now with the snow. So if you look out my window, I don't know if you can see it, that's the snow out the back window. So that's my balcony. So the sky is almost disappeared. We're expecting another 40 centimeters of snow tomorrow. So and this, you know, snow gets high when it gets blown by people. So blown snow, you know, it accumulates. But this isn't blown snow. This is straight fallen snow. Nobody's blown the snow there. It's just fallen there. So it's still huge. Anyway, so I do feel that nature is being a bit playful with us, perhaps in response to, because we know that the snow is partly a result of the high quantity of snow, and the cold season that we've had is a response to a perturbation of the jet stream. So it is a climate change related thing that has led to this heavy cold spell and the snow that comes with it this year. So so nature is being playful with us in our perturbations of nature. So there's a kind of give and take here going on. And the other thing I wanted to say about play and series is an anecdote. So some time ago, many years ago now, there was a article in Scientific American about about a kind of a game. It was Martin Gardner who did a lot of work on. It was kind of a playful way of looking at science, a lot of the stuff that he did, and he published an article about a particular kind of game, which is a kind of a meta game. And the idea was it was a set of rules about making rules. And the idea was you got a group of people together and you read the rules, and then you worked within the rules to play a game, which was about modifying the rules, right? So I thought, oh, this is cool. So I got together a group of friends and I said, oh, we could do this. And, you know, I thought, oh, we would have like several hours of interesting exchanges doing this, right? So I got these friends together and we sat down and I read through the instructions, and they all, and we all took it on. And I have to say, within 10 minutes, the group had collectively thrown out all the rules, and there was no game. It ended there. So I was very frustrated. I thought we would have hours of playing this thing, and they used the rules to throw them out. So there was a very interesting lesson there for me. Possibly they didn't want to play the game, and that was their their way of doing it. But obviously they didn't cheat. I mean, they did and they didn't, right? In the Batesonian sense, right? They played within the rules, but they used the rules to break out of the game. So I think that was a kind of, anyway, it's certainly pertinent to the discussion, that the way Gregory Bateson brings it. And final comment about this, I just want to finish off with his last two lines from the Metalogue. Daughter, daddy, why do kittens and puppies play? Father, I don't know. I don't know.
So do you have any rules for us, Geoffrey, before we get started?
I think the first rule is you couldn't throw out the rules.
Great. My first thought, and I'm going to keep this short because I'm focused on the nature side of it. I couldn't quite depict exactly what was going on, but it looked like snow was maybe 9/10 of your window.
Yes.
Perhaps. Okay. Then that's quite a bit of snow. And
yes.
Here in Kentucky, we have the weather play games on us constantly. It's always fluctuating. There's not a consistent, well, here's snow and more snow. It's 60 degrees today. Yesterday it was 20 degrees, at least Fahrenheit. So below freezing, above freezing, and it switches back and forth every 2 or 3 days. But yes, we too are affected by this climate change cycle and jet streams, and so I'm picking up on, again, each of our individual modes of nature and being encompassed in nature. And like, is there we keep mentioning the climate changing story as the story that's kind of binding us all together, or we realize we're in this bind together. So that's one thing I'm exploring right now. I'll pass the stream over to John. I'm sure he has better words to say.
No, that was great. This is a hugely difficult chapter. Mm-hmm. I've read it a long time ago, probably in the 80s. I went out to Santa Cruz and did a course in epistemology and modeling with some of Gregory Bateson's students. And I also worked with clients directly in different, and with groups, and for different kinds of purposes. But I read this chapter again, and it still is extremely slippery. And I think that is what Bateson sort of he was criticized by a lot of therapists. His theories of schizophrenia, and in this theory of logical types, he's drawing upon logic and different kinds of logics, and how he's looking at the law of the excluded middle, Aristotelian logic, which we've inherited from the Greeks. He believes is a sort of disrupts the flow of our human communication, because we have, none of us function that way. So he's looking at meta-message, para-message. All of these are different levels So there is a message, and then there's a message about the message. So there's a built-in self-reflexivity, and that is a strange loop, as I think Hofstadter makes that assertion that, you know, we get into these strange loops when we start to say things like, the Cretan says, all Cretans are liars. So that's a paradoxical message. There's something self-reflexive in that sentence. It's a sentence about the sentence. Groucho Marx saying, I would never join a group that would allow me as a member. That's a sentence that is self-reflexive. It's a comment about itself. So I think this is very tricky. And I know Bateson, he would look at schizophrenics, someone who was labeled a schizophrenic, and he would look at the system that they were in, the family system. And he would often note how there would be a literalness in the messages that the schizophrenic would offer, which would puzzle other people. For instance, a schizophrenic writes a note to his mother, and the note says, "You have been just like a mother to me." And the mother gets very upset and presents this in the family therapy. She says, "I'm not like a mother. I am your mother." So I think these are the kind of things that. So it's that's the kind of thing that I think Bateson says. These binds are very. You can't go into a conversation and take a meta perspective and count all the binds in the group or in the exchange, because he says that is that actually distorts even further this kind of interplay between levels. So you can't count these binds because they're relational. There's something that's happening in between I and thou that is very slippery. So I'm just adding to this, and I'm sorry if this sounds a little convoluted, because it is convoluted. It's very complex, the digital and the auditory digital, and the what I see, what I hear, what I feel, what I taste, what I touch, and what language does. I'm just going to read briefly this. I think it's in this on the third page. He says he's talking about human and non-human mammals, and he says, and he's talking about a visit to the zoo. He says, "I knew, of course, that there was no likelihood of finding denotative messages among non-human mammals, but I was still not aware that the animal data would require an almost total revision of my thinking. What I encountered at the zoo was a phenomenon well known to everybody. I saw two young monkeys playing, engaged in an interactive sequence of which the unit actions or signals were similar to, but not the same as those of combat. It was evident even to the human observer that the sequence as a whole was not combat, and evident to the human observer that to the participant monkeys, this was not combat." So the monkeys were acting as if they were fighting, but their gestures were indicators, were a mock fight. So it's not I'm pretending like I'm biting you. I'm not really biting you, because then that would create pain. So the nip is not a bite, and the animals can communicate this to one another non-verbally, without language. But I'm going to segue briefly into what animals teach us about politics, which Brian Masumi, is his very brilliant text.
It's a lovely text, I agree.
And I'm just going to quote his, just a paragraph that I think is really provocative. He's calling it the zoology of play. And he makes a comment upon what I've just read from Bateson. Gregory Bateson recounts his reflections on play were inspired by a visit to a San Francisco zoo. Two monkeys playing with each other drew his attention. That their ludic actions were similar to, but not the same as those of combat, was evident even to a human observer. Bateson's analysis stemmed from this observation of play, including an observation of the inclusion in the scene of the human observer. However, in the rest of his essay, Bateson never returns to the issue of the inclusion of the human observer and the evidence of what it sees. It is as if, against everything he says about play and reflexivity in language, he reverts on this point to the unreflexive assumption that the animal and its evolutionary relation to the human can simply be denoted. The presence of the human observer absent-mindedly placed under erasure. What would animality denote if one of the things it didn't denote was this forgetting? Where is the play in Bateson's own observation-based analysis? The animal politics of play needs to confront these questions revolving around spectatorship. Now, I think I'm just adding that because I think Masumi is taking a meta perspective to Bateson. Bateson presents his frame. He's at the zoo. He's the observer. He's watching captive animals doing what he, the observer, calls play. And he's extracting from the behaviors of those animals who are in a cage, not in the wild, certain features. But there's no place in his analysis where he includes, where he steps out of that and looks at the human observer and its spectatorship and what that spectatorship relies upon, like animals in a cage. And so a lot of the data that has been gathered, if it's gathered in a zoo, I think the suggestion here by Masumi is it's not the same as in the wild. And animals in the wild behave very differently than they do in a zoo. And I'm just bringing that up because I think spectatorship, we don't have a very good theory for that yet in this computer internet age. And we, or in our game theory. And I believe it's extremely challenging for us to make sense. I think this is something that Nora Bateson mentions in this interview, which has been lost. It's been taken offline. I wish she would put it back because it was, to me, one of the best interviews she's ever given. But maybe she was getting into territory she may have felt it was too risky in this particular political climate that we're in. But I'm getting this feeling, and I've voiced this before, that sometimes this flat screen, and we've talked about the effects of the flat screens on our affective space signals. It feels, when we're looking at little heads in little boxes, all arranged next to each other or on top of each other, I believe it can profoundly distort the mood signals. And that's why I'm so glad that we're not doing that here when we post our videos, our group videos online, so that we don't arrange little heads in cells on top of other heads in cells. Because it gives me, since I watch these videos and I study them, it makes me sick. I watch about an hour of that and I'm feeling really weird. And I believe that a lot of people, and I think that's because I'm hypersensitive to the mood signals. And so I'm just thinking if people are spending a whole lot of time with these flat screens, doing most of their socializing in a flat screen environment, it is no wonder that we're having so many challenges in our social worlds, in the health field, in our politics, and add to that all the nefarious subliminal messages which are intended to screw up people's sense making. Even if everyone was totally well intentioned, I think we still are in this. I think the possibility of binds and double binds and triple binds are proliferating at an alarming rate. I consider this, and you know, but I think we all have to find a way of pressing the pause button, getting out of this, using this technology for creative purposes, as I believe we are doing here. But also, you know, going to the park and watching the children play is going to be, I think, extremely important that we maintain our sense of you know, continue to maintain a, how do we make sense? And how do we work with the perceptual? As well as functioning with an expanding repertoire of concepts, because that's not going to stop anytime soon. But I think we had a conversation with Doug, Doug and I, with Dave Loeffler, we did a video, and I watched a course with him, and he's talking about the history of technology and the effects of technology, and how the interiors of people are shaped by their use of technology. And I thought it was a generative conversation. There are many, many layers. But I think that we're at a kind of turning point where we could, you know, there's a bifurcation point. It goes up in a way that could create lots of opportunities and well-being for many, many people, or it could go in a downward and collapse the ecology very quickly, because our symbols, the symbols that we share, symbols are shared. It's different from a sign. There are signs, and then there are symbols. Symbols happen between I and thou. But if our symbols get disconnected from the ecology, like the gross national product, or the winner takes all in a political contest, whether it's a Democrat or a Republican, I think those symbols start to, when they become disconnected from the ecology, can kill us. And we've shot ourselves in the foot, and we've tried to run a relay race. This is, I think, what Davor was saying. It's something that we've done to ourselves. So I think that's very sobering. And that's why I love that we're getting together and focusing our collective attention on this particular text, because I think it continues to resonate, and I believe drive a lot of reflection. Like Masumi, he's still reading Bateson. So thank you all for this. I hope this. I've had a little too much caffeine this morning, but I hope this makes some connections for you guys. Thank you very much.
You raised some very important things, Johnny, as usual. One of the things that I found is that I struggled with this text is that Bateson, he talks about this sense of this framing, right? This what you're calling a meta message, but he says, or he doesn't actually say it. He says it almost more in the Metalogue than he says it in the article. That this kind of framing it cannot be said, right? He sort of, it cannot be said explicitly. You cannot directly, if you express it explicitly, you've lost the frame, in a sense. And so the framing is always implicit and never explicit. And of course that's, and even in his own writing in these texts, that's true, right? So even in the Metalogue where he talks about these things, he never actually says things explicitly. So there is this, it's a very subtle point somehow. But while I was reading this, I was thinking, in a way, it's part of the problem we have. It's part of the, anyway, this is my take on it. It's part of how we've got ourselves into trouble with the environment. Because to address the environment is a kind of frame. The planetary ecology is a kind of frame. And to address the frame, to correct the problems we've created for the environment, is to bring to the surface these things that have been done in an implicit way before and never consciously brought to the surface, right? So the difficulty we have correcting the terrible things we've done to the planet is partly because these are part of the implicit framings of our actions, and therefore very difficult to access in an explicit way, right? So this is partly why I think this chapter is far more important than it looks to be. You know, the chapter looks to be about play, and yet it isn't. It is a kind of chapter about everything that we're doing, for which play is a kind of prototype or template or entry point into it, rather than, you know, so the reference to so the other thing I wanted to say about that, and I think it's also brought in by Nora's text. Let me read a little bit from the, I think it's about, it's near the end of Nora's text. While it's hard to resist, seeking agreement at the level of detail suffocates the ecological possibilities of conversation. My father used to say, the new comes out of the random. Mutual learning happens in the entropy. We need the confusion to release the new. This stance exists everywhere in nature. It is the swarm of confusion that becomes the grace of the way things come together. The individual paradoxically is both erased and brought to another kind of existence in noticing her participation in a larger context. In the space between the instrument, the musicians, the notes, the audience, and silence, the song arrives. Maybe referring to Doug's Star Song. It is not in the instrument, nor is it in the musician, nor in the silence. The notes on the page are a map, not a territory. New meanings, new levels of understanding come pouring into combinations born of our eagerness for contact. Minds, great or otherwise, do not think alike. They echo back and forth in responses to responses. So, and she makes a point of this idea that we are like each other is a fiction, and that we need to be more perhaps aware of how different we are from each other, rather than how alike we are to each other. I mean, it's a kind of a paradoxical message, because in a way, dealing with otherness and the sort of rejection of otherness that we're experiencing today, there's a kind of need to embrace the commonalities between people. But I think, in a way, embracing the differences between people is perhaps the more important message, right? So, or, you know, that looking for the commonalities between people is only half the job. Looking for and recognizing the differences between people is the other half of it. So I think about, you know, I used to, you know, I've been in long-term relationships a number of times over the course of my life. And when we're in a long-term relationship with somebody, the danger is that we project onto them a model of who they are. which is totally different from who they actually are. And we fool ourselves into thinking that the model is the person. And it becomes extremely pernicious in the relationship to do that. But I mean, we all do it to some extent. And so the issue in a long-term relationship is to always look beyond the models that we're developing about the other person and try to see past the models, right? So this, I think, is partly what Nora Bateson is talking about in her text, that we need to stop looking at our own models of the world and each other and listen. So this is part, I think, of what she's saying when she says sense making, not meaning making, because sense making is about our immediate perceptions as opposed to the more conceptual level, which is meaning making. And I think this emphasis on sense making is to pay attention to the immediacies of our perception, and not to get caught up into this conceptual world where we start to fool ourselves in terms of what's going on, right? So I think this is maybe I'll stop there, but it's a kind of an echoing back some of the things that you said, Johnny. And Brian, I love his writing. I'm in an exchange of emails because he asked me to review a work last year, and it was quite a lot of work, and we're in the process of talking about the next stage of reviewing this text. So it's lovely to spend some time with, even online with Brian, so and think about his work.
I'm thinking right now of how deep the Batesons' maybe tacit knowledge or ability to explicate this tacit knowledge through their writings. An example of this is the cliche passage in the Metalogue. She asked, "What's a cliche?" And so we get a history of the word, which I didn't know about, as to why we have cliches such as "it goes without saying," phrases like that. And it was originally a shortcut, a framework for a printer to have set phrases or common words, maybe and or the or le, la, le, whatever it might have been for the Frenchman, already set into its placement. So cliches are useful tools to present an idea or to get past the rules of the framework. Well, these words are the rules we have for the language we speak, so they will be cliches within our language. Then he goes on, or the dialogue goes on to say, well, once a new language is introduced, the cliches are taken apart and perhaps placed into a different language for others to understand. And the daughter asks, well, we don't just pile them, we don't completely dismantle. The printer is rearranging with the knowledge of where it needs to go. It's not a dismantling one language and jumping into another. So it's showing that there are interconnections. So I really like that passage. And while the two of you were talking, I'm thinking of how, well, with the climate change, yes, we cannot control the environment directly. We can use technology. Some of it will be useful, but as we mentioned, introducing newness also creates a bigger mess, a bigger muddle. But we do have things that were cliches that we can work with in order to proceed. And that goes with long-term relationships versus short-term relationships. In order to build a long-term relationship, you do need to gently place the pieces in the right spot, form a common thread of cliches, or a framework to work with, a printer's page. But once the progression goes, then there's spaces for creativity of creating new neologisms. I forget how to pronounce it, but yeah. And thanks for throwing in Masumi. I hadn't read that text, but I have that one on backlog, the long list of readings to do.
Well, there's a lot going on in this conversation, and I think the models and frames and frameworks, and models and meta models and theory. What's the difference between a theory and a model? I think these are big questions, certainly in how we conduct science, but also how we conduct research and how we explore our relationships. I'm thinking about frames and what you mentioned about how it's so, it's implied. The rules are not given. That's what culture is. It's all the stuff we don't talk about. But when we walk into a restaurant or into a church or into a shop or into a cabaret, there are rules and we know what they are. Or we go to an emergency room at a hospital and we intuitively, like, who's in charge here is very important to us. And we panic if we sense there isn't anyone in charge, because then we don't know what the frame is. So we're very aware of these rules, but it gets very tricky when we want to change the rules for whatever reason. And then in therapy, there's sort of an implication that some sort of change is going to happen, some sort of change for the better. And I think Bateson sort of is looking at the relationship between the therapist and the client or the patient. And there's some kind of, there's some sort of rules that are implicit that are then made explicit, and then the rules can be changed. So I think that's when things go well in therapy. They sometimes do not go well at all in therapy. And you often find a client isn't being listened to or doesn't feel like they've been heard. And when they say, excuse me, but I don't think you're understanding me, and the therapist just talks louder about their own way of conducting therapy, that can be a problem. I remember Stephen Gilligan, who's one of the best therapists I've ever worked with. He was having trouble in his marriage. He himself was a therapist. He went with his wife to many therapists and seeking some assistance. And he was often extremely disappointed because the therapist, instead of working with the perceptual space of the couple, they tended to go into their concepts about the relationship. And so that was very instructive for him as a practitioner of therapy. And I think those are those kinds of healing relationships that we require, because our cultures are getting so fragmented and so complex, and our communities are so stressed. I think the field of therapy is really in disarray. I have noted that there are novel experiences that people can bring into therapy. And if the therapist has never had those novel experiences, they can easily reduce and dismiss. And I think this is because we have, and many therapists, we have some, of course, there are some brilliant therapists out there, but I think we don't have an adequate theory for the imagination. I think I'm drawing on Geoffrey Kripal here. And he's a professor of religion. And he looks at the paranormal specifically, and the reports that a lot of people give that are anomalies that don't fit a materialist paradigm. And I think that he presented a fascinating case of a woman who had a near-death experience. She was struck by lightning, and she technically died, but she came back to life. It was one of those near-death experiences, and she had a vision with a lot of time distortion. It was only a few minutes that her heart had stopped, but she reported an experience that felt like it had happened over a period of weeks. And it was just and I won't go into the details, but that was then when she came back as a normal person, a mother, functioning in the real world, but she had total recall of what happened. And when he presents this material, Kripal has written a book with her, and I saw an interview with her, and I saw Kripal's description of her experience, and he was in a group, and there were people who immediately objected. Oh, this cannot happen. There's no such thing as an out-of-body experience. And Kripal just very gently said, well, according to her, there is. And you're really not in a position to make the claim that you're making unless you are comfortable with making a metaphysical claim rather than just a faith-based initiative here. So I think this is the kind of complexity we're dealing with right now. How can we read phenomenologically, attuned to the perceptual, and work with concepts and new concepts? And if I have a model of the world and you have a model of the world, what happens next if we can't create a model that embraces each of our different the differences that make a difference in our models? So I don't think it's a matter of not having a model. I think that would be a real muddle if we had no models at all. And I don't think Bateson wants that. But I think it's, can we have effective meta-modeling capacities, meta-communications? Can we go meta to our communication? Like I had recently on a cafe, a tone of voice. Someone said something to me, and I realized, and I pointed this out to them, to this person whom I respect a great deal. I said, can you ask me that question in a tone of voice that communicates to me that you are curious? Because I can't answer that question when I feel like you are attacking me. Because it was a very, that was the tonality. It was a simple question, but it was delivered like this. And I wasn't responding to the question, which is information language. I was responding to the, So I just pointed that out to him. It wasn't an easy moment for me or the group. I think it created some instability, but those of us who came back, apology was offered. I took a meta perspective. I think the group became a little more resilient than it was before, a little less fragile. And I believe that was my intention. Rather than to blame him, I could just pay attention to, this is what I'm responding to. I'm responding not to the content of the question. I'm responding to the mood signal that's accompanying the question. That's why so much of the legal games we see, it's not, the questions are loaded. The person who's asking the questions has already phrased the question in a way that they're going to get the answer that they want. This happens in the legal world. It happens in the educational world as well. So, and it happens in our relationships. So I think if we can tune in to the perceptual space that we share and be very mindful of the analog and how it relates to the digital, we could all go to a meta level, and we could change the rules, because the rules become explicit to it. They can become explicated. And this, I believe, would bring us towards a second order culture. We've been talking about this with Duff Loeffler yesterday. What could that possibly mean? But I think he says we're already working on the second order culture. And I think Bateson was laying the foundations for looking at first order communication and looking at second order communication, which is, I believe, meta. When enough people can take those meta perspectives and then re-embody. If you just stay in the meta world, you have no impact at all. That's extremely dangerous. But if you can go meta and then return and re-embody, I think both our perceptual space, our conceptual spaces are incredibly enriched. So that's that's sort of what I'm working on right now. Thank you.
I don't know if I'm fully in tune with the direction you were going there, but I'm sensing that the framing of kind of the meta framework, if you want to call it that, which is, we've noted, there's something deeper implied within the writing here, not just play on words or one daughter feeding off father into contemporary culture. There's some underlying core element here, which is how we exist in the world, how we make meaning, how we make sense, or maybe not meaning, but kind of broaden our idea of truth or freedom, whatever general term you might want. But I'm seeing these dialogues, these writings as just a root behavior that we have, a root structure to how we go about. So if we go back to first order and second order culture, some would say this is a trajectory of, well, we're moving from first and second. During this conversation, I'm seeing it as maybe cycles we go through. We have kind of the first order, Bateson's working on the framework of this first order and allowing perhaps some sort of framework into second order thinking. And within each conversation we have, I noticed that we always reflect on our own conversation because we're within the technology, we're within this transitional phase, whether it's just daily where somebody might say they only got 2 hours of sleep, so they're working on their own personal this or that. But as a group, as on this Infinite Conversations website, as the collective, we call ourselves sometimes, there's a constant going in and out of those phases, or bringing the second order thoughts into a first order culture. And I'm very interested in retaining the pace, retaining the trajectory into from first to second, and also continuing the cycles. I think somewhere in a reading or a conversation, it was mentioned that, or it's frequently mentioned that we're making these routines, are breaking old habits, we're making the process more agile, more open to positive improvements, or what we see as positive improvements. And once we build on those habits, we build a better framework. So figuring out how to retain that feeling, have it go across.
I wanted to reflect a little bit about this idea of the double framing that he talks about. So it's not quite an anecdote, but I think one of the first papers I ever wrote after I got started working at the university was a paper that looked at visual attention and in relation to images and how we extract information from images as humans. And one of the things I noticed when I was doing that paper was that there seemed to be three levels. Essentially, the way we attend to things has this double framing in it. That is to say, we can attend to one thing and its boundary. But when we attend to one thing and its boundary, we can also attend to the larger frame. It's a kind of a peripheral attention. Or we can attend to the texture inside, which is still the double framing, but going inward. So it's a double framing going outwards, where you're looking at object, background, frame, or you can attend to background, object, and texture within the object. But you can't exceed the three levels. You in order to go beyond that, if you're looking at the object, the background, and the texture, and you want to pay attention to the larger framing, then you have to shift your attention out. And now you're looking at three elements, and you're neglecting the texture, because to hold all four in your attention is doesn't seem to be doable. So this is this sort of Bateson talks about it explicitly. So I'm a little bit fascinated by my own process here. So that was one of the first things I did. But certainly in terms of the kinds of way I've carried out a scientific career and the kinds of things, the ways I've looked at the world in informing the research that I've done, I have to say it's been extremely Batesonian in its ways of looking at the world, but not consciously. It wasn't where I looked at Bateson and then I consciously said, oh, well, we need to do this and then we need to apply it that way. But rather unconsciously or implicitly, I absorbed, I read the Bateson, and then it's a little bit like, I know this when you do things artistically. So if I want to write, so even for the writing that I do a lot of background research, like when I was working on the text on Poland and the Second World War. And so I read all this massive amount of research about Poland, about the Nazi experience, about the Jewish people, about the cultures, the different cultures. And then I wrote, but when I wrote, I didn't necessarily go back and look at the details of the research. Sometimes I did, but in general, I just wrote because I'd absorbed all this material, and then it came out again in the writing, and I just trusted that the research would come back out in the writing. And so I think that's the way I've done Bateson in my career. That is to say, I read Bateson, I assimilated his ideas, and then they integrated themselves into the research that I did unconsciously, because that's the process, right? So so I'm kind of impressed with my own unconscious, as it were. I do think it's one of the reasons why I felt so motivated to reread this text, is that that kind of implicit incorporation of the Batesonian, and obviously I also feel that the Nora Bateson is texts are a way of deepening some of these thoughts, because she's done a lot of deep thinking about his ideas and integrated them in ways that are as artistic as they are scientific, right? So so her assimilations and then re-expressions are extraordinarily complementary to Gregory Bateson's writings. But I do feel that this automated incorporation of his ideas means to some extent that I miss the nuances in the original because I've integrated this stuff, but I haven't gone back to look at the text. So it's one of the reasons why I was pulled to go back and look at the text and its nuances, especially in a group effort, because it allows us to tease out some of these more hidden levels of meaning that are in the text in ways that as an individual reader, I don't necessarily get. And in that way, they help enrich my own understandings of Bateson and the ways in which I apply his ideas. So it's a kind of a personal reflection about my own relationship with Bateson, I guess, that I'm expressing here.
I remember, I think it's Richard Grossinger's book. He is an anthropologist, and he was looking at shamanic healers, and he reports an account of someone who debunked shamanic healing and who went into a training to become a shamanic healer. It was a traditional shamanic, a tribal kind of setting. So it was a small enough culture where there was enough people who shared the same symbol system, so they could enter into a ritual space with one another with an intention to heal something. So they had a relationship, they had a ritual, and they had shared symbols. Anyway, he entered into the weave of this particular system, not believing at all that this would work. But when he trained, he found to his surprise that the techniques actually had material effects. So an internal process, external behavior, and actual changes in the material conditions. So he had to, his original intention, which was to debunk this stuff, he had to admit, if you use an as-if frame, it can be very powerful. And this is the basis for healing rituals, is the basis of theater, performance, art. We're just using an as-if frame. And it's amazing, if we act as if we were powerful and smart and strong, we actually can become powerful, smart, and strong. but it's an act. We're just putting it on, but it actually has actual real effects. And I think this is the value of therapy at its best, when it actually becomes creative rather than destructive, is when an as-if frame can be adopted by both the therapist and the patient-client, so that the patient or the client is not constrained by the belief system of the therapist. But if the therapist can hold very lightly his or her own beliefs while maintaining that he or she may have beliefs, but can also open up to an as-if frame, like, this person is up to something big, and I'm extremely curious about what that is. It's amazing how that relationship, when someone is holding high expectations of you, can actually generate a different kind of response than the depressed or defeated response that, most people are driven to go to therapy because they experience repeated patterns that don't work. So a new kind of patterning can start to emerge. So I think this is what good theater does, what good therapy does, what good art can do, is act as if, and this is what Devor was talking about, this the future, the anterior future, he says, that if we can have expectations. We can go into the future. We are the past of that future. And we can bring back to the present from that as if, from the features of that landscape, of that as if future. We can bring it back to now. And we can look in our system for the features that we can give us affordances, can help us take something into an actionable space with others. So I think I find incredibly compelling and very necessary right now, that we train these visionary capacities that we all have. All humans have it. It's just a matter of cultivating it and paying attention to it, and bring it into and finding the appropriate context. Because we don't, if it ain't broke, don't fix it. But if it is broke, you need some visionary capacities to be unleashed. We need to use our imaginations and act as if we can go into that future and bring something back that we can then reconstruct our current limitations around that potential. Otherwise, we're just going to be repeating over and over again what we've already done that isn't working. So we need to, acknowledge the rules the system is broke, the old rules don't work. We may not have new rules in place yet, but we can open ourselves up to this transition space, which can be very awkward and painful. But I think right now it's extremely necessary that enough people are able to maintain a quality of relationship while they make these transitions. So we are no longer becoming what we were becoming, but so we need to use our imagination and all of our knowledge. We need to coordinate. Anyway, that's what I think my mission here, and just restudy this very difficult text with a group, and hopefully we can find some applications for this in the real world challenges up ahead. Thanks.
And that program is really the program of infinite conversations, right? As a site, is to do that, right? So, yeah.
That's why I love what David Loeffler says about this second order culture. He says we're already working on it. We're already doing it. We just need to be aware that we're doing it.
I don't mind giving personal examples and maybe an update on my newly found busy household. But I think I made mention in the cafe that I had a post and then it deleted, so it was a good long, lengthy post on what's going on in my life and how it connects to the site. But the short of it is, we have 2 new breadwinners in the family. My wife and father-in-law has a employment, so we're not relying solely on my earnings, which are very tiny in the first place. So, but I'm outside the concern for financial freedom of some sort. This frees up my thought process, my time in the future. So if I decide to leave my work, which is, I like it, but it's not ideal. But this site, these concepts give me glimpses into so this anterior future. So I see life without work, or the framework of work as I do things I love in between that framework. What would happen if I removed an old framework of work and placed something new that would be outside of having to commute to a job or be concerned about benefits or silly issues like that, or go to meetings I don't desire to go to, whatever the issue might be. So there's this reflective mode that matches the reflective mode we're in right here. But at the same time, I don't want to go off the deep end and just leave my job, take a year sabbatical in I don't know, some tropical place, or go on a walkabout in Australia, whatever my heart desires. But so the possibilities are opening up. And so I like this concept of anterior future, of taking my tendrils, which I think we all do to some extent. Some of us a little bit more methodically than others. There's a lot to be said for freedom from the old, and guess I'll leave it at that. I'm still exploring what the utility of the other side is. I know it's useful. I know I have that feeling that the other side has qualities that can be dangerous or overly complex. And so, yeah, I hope we can continue these conversations. I hope my life continues to match this unknown. It's a beautiful thing if you can ride the right currents, I guess. Yeah, I know you, Geoffrey, always talk about the framework of the academic lifestyle and certain things that hold you back, while at the same time you've been consistently being subversive to that. So yeah, we're all in the same boat here, right?
Well, I was going to say, what you say resonates very strongly with me right now, because in a way, so I am in this transition period between an academic life and something else, although I'm still 2 feet in the academic world, but I'm on the part of the liftoff, so and it's been very difficult to actually disengage from the academic environment, and I think this year, chances are I will retire this year formally, and part of the reason is because of Infinite Conversations, because and the liberties that it's created in my life, right? So I mean, the whole effort that we're doing with Plenum, and the discussion around the writing that I've been doing, has lifted my writing into a whole different level, right? So I feel the need to pay attention to the writing, and the academic world, although it's still enthralling in what it offers, is less and less where I need to pay attention now. And that's a result of this exchange, not this particular one, but the larger exchanges within Infinite Conversations, which has opened up new possibilities, essentially. Say, along the same lines of what you're talking about, Doug.
I can't think of much to add to this conversation, because I feel like we've covered so much. But I think the sort of what does all this have to do with this text? And I think it does have. I think we are resonating with this, and the kind of dilemmas and paradoxes and conflicts that Bateson was studying in groups, especially. And I'm also thinking about boundaries and those liminal zones and thresholds. And we've all had those experiences when, a relationship isn't working. We might have an addiction to something or a person, or we have a job that isn't working. And we'll put up with it for maybe a very long time. And then there comes a moment where you just say, I've had enough. And you reach a threshold. And something pops. It's often for me, it's very kinesthetic. And then I know I'm on the other side. And I know I'm on the other side because when I look back at where I was, I can't go back. It's over. And there's a kind of, thank God it's over, but it's also feels a little spooky because there's something new here and I don't have a program for it yet. And I think as we've all had the experience, we were all infants, we were toddlers, we learned how to walk and talk and ride a bike and, you know, do all kinds of things. Now we're playing with computers. I think we've gone through many different transitional spaces where we've had these thresholds, and you wake up one day and you know you're not a baby anymore. But there's a period, every baby, every toddler goes through a period of, once they've learned how to walk, they sometimes get on their knees and crawl for a while. And then they'll get up and walk. Because they sort of want to go back to where they were, just to sort of rehearse those routines so that they can let them go. And once you're an established walker, you never start crawling again unless there's an emergency and there's a really tight space, and then you'll find yourself being able to crawl. But I think that's very fascinating, how we sometimes, once we've gone past the threshold, once we know we're not teenagers anymore, we're young adults, once we know we're no longer adults, but we're mature adults. And then all of a sudden we realize, oh, we're seniors. And that could be scary for some people. It could be liberating for others. I find it really fascinating, because I think I'm holding a kind of curiosity about, well, I don't have to obey the rules and regulations that others have laid down in previous generations about what an elder is. I can make up whatever I want to, you know, just as I did when I went through my teens and my adulthood. So I think this is kind of fascinating, and when we, in these complex, unstable systems that we're in socially, I think it's going to be incredibly important that the intergenerational interplays can be, those communiques can become more resilient, more strong, more grounded. Because it's like Margaret Mead said, she was talking to a young group, young people. And she says, if you don't have a grandmother, you better go out and get one. Because there's some things that only a grandmother can teach you. It's not something you can get out of a book. And I think that's true for the elders as well, that they need to be around young people because it breaks up their habitual patterns. And I think this is what we're doing. That's part of what we're doing here, is different walks of life, different age groups, hopefully more diversity, but not just diversity for its own sake, but how do we integrate all of that diversity? Because if we don't integrate it, it's not a good idea just to have more and more thought forms floating around in our system. Not a good idea, believe me. Because when you go to bed at night and those thought forms are swirling all around, you need to like blow a whistle and say, all thought forms vanish, so that I can have a good night's sleep. And I think this is the challenge for artists and writers and actors, is once you take off the makeup, you know, taking off the costume after the performance, you want to go home and be a normal person. But if you haven't made that transition from being on stage performing, perhaps a psychotic, crazy person, and you take that home with you, your personal life is going to be miserable. So I think all performers are aware of this, why they need that ritual, why they need that proscenium arch, the curtains, the makeup, 8 o'clock curtain. You're ready, you hit your mark, curtain goes up, you perform, curtain comes down, it's over. And these are the ways I think we've culturally sanctioned these liminal zones, so that they don't turn the system into total chaos. They're safe. We can have these moods, these affective zones, these liminal zones can stimulate us and create conditions for change, because our imaginations collectively get extremely stimulated by these theatrical displays, or a movie, or a play, or whatever, or a novel. or a poem or a dance. But I think it's a challenge, I think, to integrate these kinds of experiences, because sometimes they can be overwhelming and fragment a person if they're too fragile. So that's an ongoing challenge, I believe, for the artist in this sort of neoliberal, monetizing everything kind of world. Because most artists would do it for free if they could, because they love it. And I think this is so hard to take what you love and and try to monetize it. I think that's very difficult, whatever that is. How do you monetize this? And I think that's the dilemma we're in, is that there are a lot of things we can't monetize, like the ocean. How much is the ocean worth to us? And I think that kind of question is starting to loom very large right now, as people say, well, who's going to pay for this? Well, how much is the ocean worth to you? I think this is what Octavia Cortez is sort of bringing to our attention in this new Green Deal that she's promoting, which I hope we'll study. I hope you brought that up the other day, Doug. But I think we should study it very seriously, what she's proposing in 10 years to wean ourselves off of fossil fuels, which is actually what we need to do. How are we going to find the political will to make something like that happen? I think we need a lot of visionaries working overtime.
I was reminded in what you were saying, John, about the anecdote that Nora Bateson recounts in the text that we read the last week about the discussion with her daughter about the future is not in the hands of the young people, but in the relationship between young people and the older people. It's the relationship that has the wisdom, not the young people per se. I thought this was brilliant, and it's related to what I read earlier today about the space between the musicians, the silence, and this is where so it's in the relationships where things emerge. I wanted to, I sort of agree with you, John, that we've sort of done a kind of a circuit around many of these subjects. But I do feel that we kind of skipped over crispy, dry moods. And I'd like to come and sort of finish up the session today with a focus back onto the poem, because it's one of the things that I think that we have a tendency to do with these discussions is we talk about the conceptual ideas that both Nora and Gregory bring forward, but we often kind of slide over the poetic contributions that Nora is making, and they are as important in their own way as are the conceptual. And this particular poem is not that easy to sort of get your head around or your feelings around. I must admit I was a bit perplexed about it until we started talking about the infinite conversation site. And then I suddenly realized that in a way, you could apply the poem to that context. So for instance, when she says, deferred is metallic anger in a flash of flame, that could have burned in earth and honesty, say damn it, crack the crust off, shatter the pattern. That's to some extent what we've been trying to do with these discussions, right? Is to shatter the what is it? The too long saturated in time's dampening, right? To shatter the pattern caused by this saturation in time's dampening, right? And then I will see your crackle and fan it. I would rather rescue the crashing swell from its detour, collide with boulders, and applaud the majesty of far-flung droplets sprayed in triumph. This is, again, a kind of celebration that is part of the activities that we've been doing here, because we are far flung. So it was I'd be interested in your thoughts about resonances between the poem and what we're doing in our lives and the context here.
Could you do me a favor? Could you read the whole thing? It's a short text.
Yes,
Sure.
I'd
love to hear it out loud. Thank you.
So crispy, dry moods, index fingers knot as we pass in the kitchen, touching your angles. Crispy, dry moods lose their snap, too long saturated in time's dampening. Deferred is metallic anger in a flash, a flame that could have burned in earthen honesty. Say, damn it, crack the crust off, shatter the pattern. But then some routine fungus fuzzes in, catches gravity in grooves, lands all the fierce spears softly. The everyday spirit drenchers spread in even layers. Meanwhile, waves smash upon the sides of the day, judgments, impatience, creep through the promise of love and enter the alchemy. Symmetry lifelessly tucks the corners, smooths the countertops, but that's okay. It's okay. I will see your crackle and fan it. I would rather rescue the crashing swell from its detour, collide with boulders, and applaud the majesty of far-flung droplets, sprayed in triumph, wildness in unfolded, unmeasured glory. The salve of the tiger unframed is the gentleness of your hands.
So I originally had trouble with the last 2 or 3 lines trying to figure out the salve of the tiger unframed. When I first heard that, well, I think I've read this 4 or 5 times. And just now, that makes some sense based on the conversation we had today. I'm almost afraid to go into how I read the poem, but I like the dryness. This is not sizzling bacon that's oily, or there's no wetness. It's crispy and dry. So the dryness really adds. And I took it as 2 ways. There's a coolness, a detachment. This is airy quality here. And fire and air versus kind of the water and earth. Though she gets into that when the fungus kind of creeps in. So you think the door is closed, but the fungus reaches the joints and doesn't allow the door to completely close. There's something else forming. And she calls it routine fungus. So it's the climbing back into a framework. And fungus is just seen as a little bit messy, damp, mysterious in a way. It's always underfoot and always growing underground, spreading in many different ways. But I like how it's the index finger nodding as they pass motion. So then he's kids index finger. It's almost there's a lot of in this poem. It wouldn't be that long of a locking. It'd be interlocking, getting the feel of the mood. So this is a crispy, dry mood they had been in. And that interlocking locates them within the space and the kitchen, the morning's framework, whatever it might be. or the fight from the day before is what I imagine was going on, or conflicted messages. So when they separate, there's kind of a snap, but there's also a gentleness in the hand. So they're losing that snap judgment, that yeah, she says the crispy dry mood loses the snap. So with her poetry, I don't think I mentioned, this is going into Nora Bateson as I perceive her through her writing. It's tough to get in her framework. Some of it seems, I don't want to use the word amateurish because it's not. It's the language uses a lot of earthy elements or almost a general feeling for something. And there are a lot of cliches sometimes until you read between the lines, until you understand, well, she's got quite a framework going on here that isn't a framework at all. So her words, once I revisit them more and more, there's more than meets the eye. So I'll leave it at that. But this poem opened me up to her poetry, perhaps. Though I have, like the past poems I've read, I'm going to be rereading them as well.
Thank you both. That's beautiful readings. I don't know if I have anything to add, except to me, this kind of moves towards, I think there's a turning point in the poem. And I think it comes right after symmetry lifelessly tucks the corners, smooths the countertops. But that's okay. It's okay. To me, repeating okay, it's sort of like that, I'm not sure it's okay. It's okay. Because the symmetry lifelessly tucks the corners, smooths the countertops. So it's a kind of order that is imposed upon this unpredictable liveliness. And it reminds me, and I don't know if I'm reading this at all well, but at the end of the Metalogue that we were looking at today, which you quoted earlier, Geoffrey, Father says, it's more like what kittens and puppies do. Perhaps, I don't know. And there's a pause. Daughter, Daddy, why do kittens and puppies play? Father, I don't know. I don't know. To me, that has a kind of spookiness to it. And I think it's sort of, it's that kind of it's a mood signal. And I think it's both of these encounters with Nora and her father are interesting, because the Metalogue, by the way, is not necessarily about, it's about his first daughter, I believe, Catherine, not Nora. So I think there's a relationship between the sister, the daughter, the mother, and the father principle. And I think this what we're doing with this cross-fertilization happening between these two different texts, between the daughter and the father. And I think you did a wonderful, brilliant play upon that by creating that dialogue, Doug, where you looked at the mother and the son. And I can only imagine what kind of dialogue would we have had if Bateson had a son. I think it would be a very different one than the one that we're enjoying today. May have been interesting, because I wonder how he would have dealt with the father-son dynamic, because those are different dynamics. Then, you know, you're a being with lots of testosterone flowing in your body with another being who has testosterone flowing in your body. It's a different kind of relationship at a biological level. And I don't want to overstate that, though. I think it is important. And how some, you know, how do we create rules for the new relationship that are happening as every child comes into this world with hopefully a father and a mother who's paying attention. As my parents have told me, my mother, you know, she has different relationships with each of her children, and all of her children were boys. But there's, you know, and you know, I've often heard parents say, "I love all my children equally," but that's not what I observe in their actual behavior. But that can change over time, you know, because the parents change over time. Things that I thought my parents believed, I found out later in life when I'll quiz them on something that happened in our shared past, they don't remember it that way. And you know, their relationships with their own parents changed during the interim between that kind of inquiry. So I think it's very tricky, this intergenerational stuff, and what we repeat, what we delete, and what we have amnesia for. But anyway, going back, I think that's in this poem. That was a long digression, I apologize, but I think that's okay. It's okay. I feel like that's where there's a liminal zone, a threshold, and I believe that last part that we read seems to me to be like a coda, sort of a reflection upon this dynamic that's happened in this poem. But I have to reread it again a couple of times. Thank you.
That was lovely, both of you. In some ways, I find the poem is kind of, so we were talking about sense making and meaning making. It's a kind of play between the two, because all of her images are sense images. I mean, but then the conceptual stuff creeps in the back, as it were. So it's kind of there's a bit of an interplay between the two. And perhaps that's true of many of her poems too, that it has these two levels to it. I must admit that I'm maybe beginning to get a sense of the poetry as we read through them. We haven't talked a lot about them. We've read sections of them, but we haven't talked a lot about them. And they're not necessarily easy poems, right? I tend to be drawn to poems that have strong imagery and emotional connections, whereas this is fairly conceptual in a kind of way, which makes it a little bit more difficult to access. I think in a way, the poems make sense in the context in which they're placed. That is to say, they're juxtaposed with the essays. And so in a way, they are part of a larger whole for which you need to understand the other elements. So the essays, and it's the interplay, it's the relationship between the poems and the essays which contains the information rather than the poems per se, right? So
I think we lost you, Geoffrey. Your screen froze. Maybe he'll log back on.
That happened once before when he made a closing statement and then dropped right out at the exact moment that he needed to. But I'm afraid to just end right there.
Yeah, we could wrap up. Actually, it's almost time.
Yeah,
Like we've covered a lot today.
Yeah, a lot to chew on.
Yeah.
There
You're the host now. Okay, great.
So we determined that you would likely or you will do next week's lead.
If you want me to, would you prefer that?
I would prefer that you prepare, and then the week after that, I should be, if nominated, I'll take that role.
Okay.
With more time on my hands. So.
Sure. And then you just have to give me a little tutorial on how to do this.
Right. I should be able to make it on time. If not, I'll give you a guiding hand.
Great.
All right.
So we'll see each other next week then.
Right. And keep in touch about anything you'd like on Tuesday's page, the cafe page.
Oh, I sent you a message.
Okay. Great.
Thank you. And say hi to Lucy. Hi to everybody. Bye to Geoffrey.
Bye,
See you all next time.
everyone.